Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest European Parliamentary Research Service, a roundtable, which is on institutional issues. This is the second of two events which we're organising this summer to mark the second anniversary of the beginning of the five-year political cycle from 2019 to 2024 in the European Union. We did one in mid-May, which marked the second anniversary of the European elections. And now we're doing one to mark the second anniversary of the start of this new parliamentary term, because it was on the 1st of July 2019 that the current European Parliament took office, a parliament which saw a very significant turnover of members. Around 63% of the members at that time were new to the parliament, but it also saw a very significant increase in turnout, reversing the trend which had continued in previous European elections on a downward path. And to discuss these issues, not only to do with the implications of the European elections, but what's been happening since and how the EU political system has evolved in the intervening 24 months, especially in response to the coronavirus pandemic, which hit so early in and has literally buffeted the European institutions, changing their patterns of behaviour, but also changing the policy mix of what they can offer to the European public. We have a very distinguished panel of experts, and it's a mixture of what I would call, on the one hand, academics, pure academics, and on the other hand, academic practitioners, people who have been both in the world of academia and themselves in the front line of elective politics. And we're particularly privileged to have join us today Danuta HÜBNER, member of the European Parliament, former chairman in this particular context of the Constitutional Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, but also chaired the Regional Affairs Committee in the Parliament, former European Commissioner. She was the first commissioner from her own country here in the EU, former Minister of European Affairs in Poland, and a professional academic by origin and still professor at the Warsaw School of Economics. So thank you so much, Professor HÜBNER, for joining us today. We really appreciate that. And she's going to set the scene with some reflections on the EU institutions 2 years into the cycle. And then we have a panel which is partly comprised, predominantly comprised, in fact, from colleagues who come from what's called the Bridge Network. And the Bridge Network is an EU-sponsored alliance of universities that have a special interest in EU institutional affairs. And Federico FABBRINI is the coordinator, in effect, of that, and also professor at Dublin City University, where he also chairs something called the Brexit Institute that's recently been created there. Welcome to you. Welcome to all of your colleagues. Richard Corbett, a practitioner who, of course, is very well known to us in the European Parliament, former MEP, former political advisor to Herman Van Rompuy when he was president of the European Council, and co-author, of course, of a book which is very much the landmark text on the evolution of the European Parliament in recent decades, the European Parliament, which I think has been to 8 or 9 editions so far. He is going to react to Professor HÜBNER's remarks and reflect upon the emergence of different tendencies in the way the EU institutions are currently functioning, alongside not only Professor FABBRINI, but also his colleagues from the Bridge Network, Helle, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Copenhagen, and Matteo, SCOTTO, Research Fellow at the Villa Vigoni. And together, I think they provide a very nice combination of perspectives on the questions that many people are asking. Questions like, how far has the working practices and the patterns of behaviour of the institutions been permanently shifted by the crisis? How far are we moving towards a more activist federal level, particularly with the doubling of the EU budget? Or is NGEU something of an optical illusion in this respect? Because although it significantly increases the amount of money that's being spent at European level, there are some strong intergovernmental dimensions to the way that that money has been constructed and maybe monitored and implemented in practice. How far has the turnout that we saw in the recent European elections been a reaction or a reflection of positive developments, the increasing importance and centrality of the EU institutions in people's lives and an awareness that what Europe does matters? Or how far was it a product of protest forces or disillusionment, ironically, reflecting itself in a desire to send a message? And if so, has populism peaked in Europe, or has populism simply marked a staging post in a continuing advance? We have rule of law issues which come ever more into focus, and many other questions like this which are extremely interesting. The fracturing of the political system, the fact that there were fewer political groups in the European Parliament, but they were more evenly allocated, if you like, in size, does that mark a permanent shift away from the bipolarization that we saw in the European Parliament in previous terms? So there are plenty of questions, these and many others, and I'm going to pass the floor straight away to set the scene to Professor Danuta HÜBNER, MEP, and thank you so much for sparing the time on a busy day to join us. Over to you.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for unmuting me. And I'm just worrying a bit that you put so much on our shoulders as panelists that I don't know whether we will be able to deliver, because the issues at stake are dramatic, but it's always good to hear native British speakers. I would like to start with actually a comment or kind of abstract. I'm just looking for the right word, kind of abstract or executive summary of what I want to share with you in my remarks as a participating witness of the political process of this institutional debalancing or off-balancing in the first half of the current institutional cycle, when you might know that only in 2020 we had 13 meetings of the European Council, and this year already we had 7 meetings. So I think we are actually witnessing a kind of culmination of this long-lasting process of changes to the institutional balance. And when I look at the way the recent flagship multi-policy project, which is the New Generation EU, has been organized, I actually see the petification of this dual mechanism of the EU decision-making. On the one hand, what we used to call the community method, and then the big-scale coordination of national processes, which some of us might also remember from the times of Lisbon Agenda, but these memories are rather memories of failure. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that for the last, I would even say maybe 2 decades, there has been no major transfer of powers between institutions or between also levels of governance through treaty change. Nevertheless, if you look at the EU agenda, you can see that it has moved to new policy areas, while interinstitutional balance has been also shaken. And in many important policy areas, we have been through waves of intergovernmentalism, including reaching out to international agreements among member states. And in some fundamental areas, and specifically under crisis conditions, consensus was built around national priorities and interests through coordination of national resources. In the first half of the current cycle, I think we see a short continuation of what we already have known, especially after Lisbon Treaty, which is an accidentally shaped but intentional institutional rebalancing, I think, between the European Council and the Commission, with collateral damage to the European Parliament. And competences and responsibilities, I think, might continue to be accidentally moved around through the same method also in the years to come in the future. There have been as well accidental shifts in the scope of interest of the European Council, depending also on whether its president was coming from a member state with a common currency or not. And in that case, the scope of the Commission responsibilities were just simply adjusted. So this has deepened, I think, the lack of clarity, not to say created confusion when it comes to the institutional balance. I would also say that there is a long list of instruments that the European Council has developed, enlarging its political territory, and quite recent example is the use of its conclusions to give directives to the European Commission. So practically there are no limits, I would say, to the European Council actions, with some spillovers also to the way the Council of the European Union also acts, with an amazing amount actually of non-legislative activity in several formations of the Council. So I would say that this lack of respect of check and balances has been happening through practice outside the treaty path, and has legitimacy and accountability related consequences. It also raises the question, in my view, whether decisions and coordination through intergovernmental channels provide for a sufficiently effective policymaking mechanism, allowing to deliver on all that is important, which is elements of European, on all elements of the European decision-making, on institutional efficiency, on democratic legitimacy, also on equality of service. So from the European Parliament viewpoint, this spontaneous institutional sharing of competences undermines the legitimacy and accountability dimension of decision making. As you know, the European Parliament has no prerogative to hold the European Council to account when heads of state and governments come and make decisions as national leaders. And this actually means that European Parliament does not provide accountability to decisions which are made at European level and which affect citizens that are represented by members of European Parliament. So indeed, the Parliament is concerned with the dominating method of institutional balance evolution. You might remember at the end of, no, in the middle of previous Commission, there was a message coming from Jean-Claude Juncker and also Frans Timmermans striking new balance in the Commission work between legislation effort on the one hand and policy coordination and implementation, increasing the role of the latter of the policy coordination and implementation, and legislating less. And it impacted, I think, quite seriously, not only our work in the previous term, but I think also the beginning of the new institutional cycle. If what we have witnessed for the last decade is a new integration method, I'm just hoping professors will clarify it, based on this dual vehicle. One is what we used to call community method, and the coordination of national policies is the second. I hesitate to call it union method, what the coordination really means. Then if I would be ready to understand this Juncker and Timmermans narrative on moving away from the focus on legislation toward coordination, implementation, and non-legislative decision-making as an effort to capture actually some space for the Commission in this new method that we are seeing is developing. And this emergence of double-track integration method is happening through practice, which means that it is really outside the treaty path, and as I already mentioned, has legitimacy and accountability consequences. I'm repeating it because I think for us in the European Parliament it's extremely important. And then in 2020, the crisis-proof management system hardly existed. The Union has been moving rather with high speed towards new areas of policies, and then the institutions have been trying to establish their role in this process of change. So in general, I would say that the Union has been reforming itself through the action, and the institutional roles have been identified through what I would call very pragmatic politics. And also, if you look at the new generation, we can clearly see that there is both legislative and coordinating instruments have been deployed. But frankly, when I look as this process is moving forward, what will be the results of deploying this dual mechanism of governance? It's really difficult to assess today. If we want to look at a check and balance system of the EU and reflect on rebalancing with a dose of more objective, because of course I am in my political hat and with my ideological options for Europe, but if you want to be to reflect on it with sort of more objective and less politicized criticism, then I think we first of all would need to have clarity in which direction we would like to see the EU move. Because we cannot rely, I think, on an accidental outcome things that can come out from this way, the way we are using, I think, the institutional framework in the European Union. But the problem is that if you want to be sort of objective in what you want to achieve and what is the best way to do it, then you have to face the problem, which is that the European Council like a gene. It's already out of the bottle, and you probably cannot put it back there without a radical institutional overhaul. That's how I read the situation today. So actually, the only way is to move forward. And when we think of moving forward, some of us would immediately come with the idea of merging the two functions of the two presidents, two heads of both executive institutions, the Commission and the European Council, which is for decades with us. But others would point to how weak we are without a good technology for treaty making, and would think first of all about the new treaty. And so all in your hands, Professor Fabbrini. A lot depends on your capacity to get us there. But we need, I think, more than ever, a new method of treaty making. That's, for me, it's absolutely clear. If you look at how often we had treaty changes or new treaties, it was after the single act. I think it was like later on every 5 or 6 years. Now we might be, if we have a treaty change, nearly 20 years after the moment where the Lisbon Treaty was worked on. So I think there's no other option, but in the meantime, I think we should look at the current institutional cycle as if it were a kind of transition period. But not knowing where we go through this parallel track, or if you wish, this coexistence of legislation based and being the domain of the Commission and with well-established European Parliament's responsibilities, and integration based on coordination of decentralized national resources, both legal and material, which is the domain of the European Council. Can we at all be sure about achieving what I would call a common European objective? And here comes the conference on the future of Europe. I think it is a chance for us all to talk on all those choices. And I think we can expect that there will be a pluralism of European voices on this issue without doubt, as it will also be on possible treaty change, as we already know only too well. So in the meantime, I think we have no choice but to accept this kind of hybrid governance, combining the elements of the community and intergovernmental. But we have to remember that we have opened the door for the intergovernmental procedures, not in a neutral time. We are talking about opening the door to intergovernmental procedure in the time of unprecedented, challenging and disruptive political situation within the member states of the European Union. So I think that in the debates which are ahead of us, the European Parliament will most likely not be ready to continue looking the other way when a rebalancing of European institutional equilibrium takes place at its expense. What is my additional worry is that, of course, the expansion of this intergovernmental governance makes the European policy making very sensitive, certainly more sensitive to national politics, which, as I said, is in a disruptive period. And if you look at the case of Hungary, and unfortunately the country I know best, which is Poland, it proves how national events, political shocks, anti-European political attitudes can undermine the political dynamics at European level. If you think the whole 2020, starting with the veto threat and then everything that followed, it was just because of the two countries' internal politics. And intergovernmentalism is just sort of transferring these internal attitudes and problems to EU level. So while I could understand partially the usefulness of an intergovernmental moment in times of crisis, when looking beyond the time of crisis, I think we need a systemic mechanism to provide legitimacy to European Union actions and decisions through transparent, accountability-based institutional equilibrium. And last elections, you mentioned, Anthony, at the beginning, I think they were very different from 2014 and the earlier ones. They were more focused really on truly European issues across the member states, basically. And I have the impression, on the basis of existing evaluations of those elections, that, and also my own experience, that there are signs of European demos emerging through a bottom-up process. So the conference, in this context, on the conference on the future of Europe, which accompanies our entry now into the second half of this institutional cycle, which gives me some hopes, it can offer a broad space for reflection on institutional rebalancing and on the best possible institutional architecture. You might have noticed that pragmatism has, like we used to have for decades, political will. Now we have pragmatism. We have to be pragmatic. This is the new buzzword in these times of crisis management and spontaneous institutional shifts. And this meant a lot of good things in 2020 and now, which is all the quick fixes of the legislation, of dispatching and piecemeal solutions, which were needed at that time. But institutional balance cannot and must not be adjusted through a pragmatic approach. That's my view, because institutions have to be trusted, and you cannot just get trust this way. So reestablishing the institutional balance must go in a direction that would reaffirm Europe's relevance, whatever it means. And here we have probably a big scope of what Europe's relevance might mean, and that's important that we discuss it. But I think the risk is that we can wake up with two centers of European policy making if we are lucky. So I think we should really be very careful in what we are investing now in terms of the structure for decision making, and we have also think what is our destination before we make the decision. So that was all my thoughts as a witness of what's going on across Europe, and I hope I provoked you at least partially to also you react, and I thank you in any case. Thank you very much, Anthony, for bringing us here, and I would like to thank all the colleagues, Professor, for joining us, and Richard Corbett. Richard, I hope you will never disappear from the European landscape. You have been permanent element of it, and I hope you will continue. So once again, thank you very much, and sorry that I have to continue with my other duty. But it was a great pleasure also talking to you. So thanks for the invitation and for making us think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really rich, stimulating, fascinating way of setting the scene and really getting us off to a flying start with this discussion. So we really appreciate it. So many interesting issues. And I must say, personally, I agree very much with this notion of the hybrid system of government. And hybridity is perhaps the buzzword of the time, but this hybrid system of governance is developing in the European Union, where you have the classic community method, which for those areas it covers seems to get deeper and deeper. And then you have so much else, which is very important in terms of the ordinary lives of people, which is essentially being developed through a series of ad hoc systems, refracted through and perhaps controlled ultimately by the politics of the European Council. I think that's a fascinating insight. Thank you very much for sharing it with us, and also with the other very interesting ideas, the need perhaps for a new method of treaty change, the bottom-up emergence of a European demos, and the fact that we should look at this period that we're in, this 5-year period, as perhaps one of transition. The really interesting question, of course, being transitioning to what? And to lead that conversation, which we will now have with our practitioner expert and our academic colleagues, is Silvia Cotonidis from the Members Research Service of the EPRS, and she will formally introduce our colleagues there and also say a few words, I have no doubt, herself. Over to you, Silvia.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you, Ms. Hübner, for your kind keynote speech. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, welcome to this roundtable. It is a great pleasure for me to moderate this day with you today. 2 years into the new political cycle, it is with Europe that is slowly exiting from the worst phases of the pandemic. Perhaps it is time to think about where we are standing now. Has the pandemic affected the political system? Are there patterns emerging in the new political scenario? Have priorities been shifted because of the pandemic, or has the pandemic become a new priority in addition to the older ones? These are some of the questions that we would like to discuss with you today. We will try to look into the political trends that are unfolding from 3 different angle perspectives. The first, the EU governance. Second, the constitutional identity of the EU. And third, the interinstitutional balance. Of course, in our discussion, we will not forget to look into the future, in the sense that we will have a look at the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is an exceptional initiative that is shaping up to be a very important moment in the European construction. We will explore how the conference can steer the future development of the EU. For today's discussion, we have 4 panelists: Professor Fabbrini, Professor KRUNKE, Matteo SCOTTO, and Richard Corbett. Can you participate? Of course you can. You are more than welcome to do so. You can insert your questions into the question and answer section of our chat. So now let's get started and let's dive into the topic of our discussion with our first speaker, who is Professor Fabbrini. Federico Fabbrini is a professor of European law at the Dublin City University and is principal of the Brexit Institute. He's also principal investigator at Bridge, which is a new funded Jean Monnet network, as Anthony has already mentioned before. Federico will tell us a bit more about this network later on. Federico has written extensively on the issues of EU governance, Brexit, EU integration, and in the last years has presented also many of his research to in front of the AFCO committee at the European Parliament. Good afternoon, Federico. Welcome to this roundtable. And I will start perhaps with a small question to you. How do you see the state of the EU integration after the pandemic, and what are the trends that you can tell us if you wish? Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia, for your kind introduction, as well as for your opening question. I'll come to that in a second, but if you allow me, I'll take just 1 minute in my role as the principal investigator of the Jean Monnet Network Bridge to thank warmly Anthony Teasdale and his deputy, Etienne Bassot, as well as the whole European Parliament Research Service for their willingness to organize this event together with us this afternoon. The Jean Monnet Network Bridge is a 3-year project funded under the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. It is led by the Brexit Institute, which I founded and I run at DCU, and it also involves 3 other partners: the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, the University of Bolzano-Bozen in Italy, and Central European University in Hungary and Austria. The purpose of the network is to study recent European crises and to reflect on the impact they have had on European governance. So our mission is to produce research, but also to engage with policymakers, and this is why we're particularly pleased of the opportunity of doing this with you. I shall also say the Bridge Network is the springboard for other research and policy projects. In particular, the Brexit Institute has been running together with Villa Vigoni a project on the new EU institutional cycle. And so I think the event today, exactly 2 years to the day when the current parliament was started operating, I think it's perfectly fitting into the ethos of our initiative. So again, thanks for the opportunity of being with you this afternoon. I'll come to your point and quickly present my remarks, which I would like to center around three issues. The first is the state of integration, second, governance, and third, reforms. So starting with the first point, and that was really your question, Silvia, I think it is fair to say that in the last 2 years, and particularly since the outburst of the COVID-19 pandemic, European integration has experienced both advancement and setbacks. On the one hand, the EU made a huge leap forward, particularly on fiscal economic issues, notably as a result of the adoption of Next Generation EU, which is really, in my opinion, a paradigm change for the functioning of Europe's economic and monetary union. But on the other hand, the EU has also, I think, witnessed important centrifugal pressures We've seen that, for example, in Schengen, one of the other big achievements and visible and tangible effects of European integration, where actually the pandemic has created pressure points on the EU, but we've seen it also remarkably in the field of the rule of law and respect for foundational values of the EU. Danuta HÜBNER was referring to that earlier as well. I know my colleague and friend Helle KRUNKE will focus on it, but certainly the rule of law crisis has actually aggravated in the last few years, and that constitutes a big challenge for European integration. So we see in terms of integration dynamics, both centripetal and centrifugal forces at play, and I think the challenge of containing the centrifugal forces has to do with governance problem, and that takes to my second point, where to a large extent I will be in fact repeating what Danuta HÜBNER has said in her remarks before, because in my opinion the state of institutional balance in the European Union is increasingly subject to what Danuta has called, I think, debalancing in reality. For a decade now, we have seen a struggle and conflicting dynamics. On the one hand, a push for greater executive role for the Commission through the Spitzenkandidaten process, and then on the other, a rise in importance of the European Council. But de facto, what the pandemic has really highlighted, in my opinion, is an increasing growth of power of the European Council, which unfortunately often oversteps its powers under the treaty. One of the foundational principles of constitutionalism, Charles Howard McElwain wrote about it almost half a century ago, is the separation between jurisdictio and gubernaculum, the role of deciding executive matter and the role of adjudicating conflicts. De facto, the European Council, particularly on rule of law issue, has almost come to play the role of a judicial power, and that is, I think, a very worrying development, which will have and has had important implication on the institutional balance of the European Union. So, how to move forward from there? And that's my third and last point. I think Europe needs reform. We cannot be complacent for the status quo, even though we successfully overcome the crisis imposed by COVID-19 with Next Generation EU, the governance problems I've referred to and that Danuta has so masterfully described in her own keynote. They require changes to the constitutional structure of the European Union. The good news is the Conference on the Future of Europe might pose a window of opportunity there. There is a potential for that process to actually serve as a catalyst for further constitutional changes. But of course, we also need to acknowledge the important risks that exist there. I've recently published in the Bridge Network a working paper on the conference, which will be forthcoming as an article in European Law Journal, where I look at both the promises and the perils of the conference. And I think those two elements will remain there until effectively the new process takes off. So from this point of view, I'm very much looking forward to hearing also what Richard has to say. I think I can stop my remarks here, and I'm happy to come back to the conversation later. But once again, allow me to thank warmly the EPRS for co-hosting this with us, and also allow me to thank both Danuta and Richard, who are long-term friends of the Brexit Institute. It is a pleasure to be engaging with you this afternoon.
Thank you, Federico. Your remarks are very to the point, synthetic, and but also very rich in the content. In fact, the issue of treaty change is one of the issues that has been analyzed, I would say, extensively by academia in recent years. And you yourself, you have written quite some interesting pieces of work on that. That perhaps, if you want, you can also talk about it later. Indeed, the issue of the treaty change is one of the issues. And I would say we ourselves in EPRS, we have seen how, in fact, without going to treaty change, one could leverage perhaps on the unused potential of the treaty. But this seems to be a part of the discussion that seems to be a bit put aside. But indeed, there is also some potential in the current treaties, and we know very well that one of the major problems of treaty change is the issue of unanimity. It is a bit old-fashioned because we know that some of the most recent international institutions have adopted different ways to change their own rules of working. So in the sense, qualified majority has been adopted in several international institutions in this respect, but still the European Union has still even the double unanimity, so unanimity of states and of ratification. So that is a big obstacle to treaty change. But thank you very much for your first remarks. I move now on to our second panelist and to our second topic of our roundtable, which is the issue of the constitutional identity. Helle KRUNKE is a professor of constitutional law and director of the Center for European and Comparative Legal Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Significant areas of interest for Helle are constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, with attention also to populist phenomena and to EU integration. Good afternoon, Helle, and again, welcome to to our roundtable. Helle, we have experienced in the recent year several crises. I mean, health crisis is under the eyes of everyone, but this has sort of snowballed into economic crisis and also social crisis. Now, into this also the capacity of the EU to keep up with the rule of law has been one of the problems that we have seen in the last 1-2 years. How do you see, and how are your thoughts on the impact of the rule of law on the constitutional identity of the EU? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I think I'm actually going to reply to your question in my presentation. So I think I will just jump directly to my presentation. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for hosting us. I'm going to share my PowerPoints with you, so just give me a second to do that. Oh, yeah. So it's actually the question I'm going to ask in my presentation is precisely whether the rule of law crisis can actually strengthen the EU. And the reason that I have chosen to ask this particular question is, of course, first of all, that as Federico explained before, our bridge network actually focuses on the many crises which have sort of challenged the EU the past 10 to 15 years. And I was wondering whether, because the focus is always on the challenges for the EU of all these crises, and I think there's no question that these crises have challenged the EU, but I'm wondering whether that is actually the whole story. And that's why I, in this presentation, would like, from a purely legal perspective, I have to say, to ask whether the rule of law crisis has been a driver of a more well-defined EU constitutional identity. And for the academics attending this seminar, and maybe also the bit more sort of nerdy individuals in the audience, I just want to say that I'm relying on the definition of EU constitutional identity by Gerhard van der Schiff, which builds on the individuality of a constitutional order, whether it's national or supranational, which is, of course, why it really fits our purpose very well. So EU constitutional identity emphasizes the EU as a distinct supranational actor in the field of constitutional law, according to this particular definition of EU constitutional identity. And before I move on, I have to say that, of course, EU constitutional identity is still a contested concept. It's not a discussion I have time to go into today, but I just want to mention it before I move on. So I think there's actually nothing really new in a way about what I'm asking, what I'm proposing, because if we look back at the history of the EU, we actually find many events which are linked directly or indirectly to sort of a closer definition, a crystallization of EU values. And I guess you could call it constituting moments in defining an EU identity, or maybe you could even call it an EU constitutional identity. I think, first of all, of course, the EU is based on values. Right from the beginning, the coal and steel community, a reaction to the Second World War, a reaction to the Cold War. We wanted to avoid war and violations of human dignity in Europe in the future. So really, in the background of the context of the formation of our European cooperation, we have values. Moving on very quickly to 1973, we have the Declaration on European Identity based on the Copenhagen Conference, which emphasized human rights as part of European identity. This was in the context of 3 new member states entering into the European cooperation, among them actually my own member state, Denmark. Moving on to the Maastricht Treaty, we saw a huge extension, I would say, of EU powers into new policy areas. And therefore, we also saw a need to legitimate the new powers. And that was done by formulating common EU values in the treaty. With the Nice Treaty, Article 7 was revised. This was, of course, in the context of the each enlargement, but it was also in the context of Austria's right-wing government in 1999, which caused sanctions from 14 member states. Fundamental values were also emphasized in the following treaty on the Constitution for Europe. And then the court comes into the picture because the first contribution from the court to establishing an EU constitutional identity is normally said to be the Caddy judgment. And that was, of course, in the field of fundamental rights. And the context at that time, it's 1 year after the Lisbon Treaty was signed, of course, after the failed constitutional treaty, and it's 1 year before the Lisbon Treaty stepped into force, which of course also meant that the Charter, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, changed its status from political to legal. And now we have the rule of law crisis, which has triggered, I would say, a crystallization of EU's values, actually both at the political institutions, but also at the court, and especially as regards the EU principle of rule of law, but not only, and I'll return to that in a second. So I just want to draw your attention to 2 observations as regards this process of crystallization of EU values through the rule of law crisis. And the first observation is that the rule of law principle in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union is now being sort of defined, I would say, as an umbrella principle. So it covers many very important sub-principles. And I'm not going to mention all of them. You can see on my PowerPoint that we really now have a much closer definition of what we mean by rule of law, what is implied in the rule of law principle. And these are all sub-principles which have been recognized by the court in the recent case law on all these sort of rule of law crisis cases. And of course, as part of this process, which is very important, these values are also turned into enforceable principles. Now, the second observation is that the EU is also starting, of course, to crystallize other values in Article 2 of the treaty, not just the rule of law principle. We also see, for instance, democracy and respect of human rights being sort of focused on, being crystallized in Article 2 of the treaty. And this way, the challenge of the rule of law crisis has already, I think, contributed to this crystallization of EU's fundamental values and principles, of course, especially in the field of rule of law. But there also seems to be a potential for a continuation of this process, bringing in other fundamental EU values, including democracy and fundamental rights. Coming to my conclusion. So the rule of law crisis has forced, I think, the EU, you could say, to reflect on and to refine the interpretation and the scope of its values and principles. And as many of you probably know, EU's fundamental values and principles are, by some scholars, viewed as common constitutional principles, by others as a shared constitutional profile of the EU and its member states, and by some as a constitutive to the European identity. And I think in light of this, and returning to the definition of EU constitutional identity, I think it is plausible actually to claim that the EU rule of law crisis has emphasized the EU as a distinct supranational actor in the field of constitutional law, that it has driven a crystallization and also a more well-defined EU constitutional identity based on the EU's experiences during the crisis. And based on that, I think we can probably also say that this is, in a way, a strengthening of the EU, at least seen from a pure legal perspective. And here it's, of course, really important for me to emphasize that this is not a zero-sum game. I perfectly recognize that, of course, all these crises, including the rule of law crisis, have all challenged the EU. But I think sometimes we also forget to see the full picture, where there are also some other things going on, maybe even some more sort of positive elements in a way, which actually strengthen the EU based on these experiences that we have been through with the crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helle. Thank you very much for your contribution. It's very interesting, and I would say even relieving to know that there is a positive element in a crisis of this magnitude and of this importance as the one of rule of law. Thank you very much. I move now on to our third speaker, who is Matteo Scotto. Matteo Scotto is a PhD researcher in political science at the University of Bonn, and is also a research fellow at the German-Italian Center for European Dialogue, Villa Vigoni. Matteo will look into the third topic of this roundtable, which is the interinstitutional dynamics and intergovernmental practices that have developed so far. Matteo, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Silvia, and thanks also for the invitation to Federico. It's a very pleasure to be here today and to have the possibility to listen to such an outstanding also scholars. I'm definitely learning a lot. I have to say that I'm a bit less pessimistic than both Mrs. HÜBNER and Federico about intergovernmentalism. My stance here, which is also a hope, of course, is that the COVID-19 pandemic represents a further step in a process that began with the Lisbon Treaty and developed during the various crises that the EU has faced in recent years, from which the European integration, by learning from its own mistakes, of course, has the potential, in my view, to emerge with a new balance, with a new institutional balance. This new balance consists in a more stable governance, based, as always, in the history of European integration process, on a combined or hybrid, as someone has already said, method of decision-making. On the one hand, we will always, of course, have the community method based on supranational institutions and applied to those powers fully delegated by the member states to the Union, with an open assumption, of course, that these powers could be extended by mutual agreement in the next future. On the other hand, and here lies the novelty, in my view, we will be heading, from my perspective, towards a more constructive and mature intergovernmental method than in the past. This means that after years of multiple crises and failures to find common solutions to common problems, the Union has been finally and yet slowly developing sufficient political maturity to reach holistic and long-term decisions, even with respect to fundamental core state policies, and not necessarily by following the path of supranationalism. In support of this argument, the first part of my brief intervention is dedicated to the relevant novelties regarding EU political resilience and crisis management mechanism related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The second part illustrates the new challenges the EU has been facing in terms of decision-making and governance, trying to investigate a possible new balance for European integration. The COVID-19 pandemic representing a defining moment with regard to the nature of this crisis and the way in which the Union decided to deal with it. As we all know, the first novelty brought by the COVID-19 pandemic concerns the singularity of the virus impact in terms of policy response. In the last decade, the European Union has already had to face multiple crises. However, none of these crises had such an intersectoral impact on European society as the COVID-19 pandemic did. Unlike previous crises, which made possible a differentiated short and medium-term policy response carried out by clusters of countries, the reaction to the virus required holistic long-term measures. A few months after the virus hit in March 2020, the European Union has decided for the first time in history to create a consistent amount of common debt, as Federico already said, in order to plan together the social and economic recovery of the Union. We must not forget that the agreement on the next generation EU was in the first place, not without initial moments of uncertainty and mistrust, a choice of the member states to cooperate, resulting in an interstate bargaining between the government's highest political level within the European Council. with the Commission following up with the implementation phase. This is the same intergovernmental approach to crisis management that in the post-Lisbon years has brought out many allegations of ineffectiveness in terms of policy delivery, threatening the unity of the European project. As a result, the recovery plan would challenge at first glance the definite assumption ascribing to the intergovernmental method the inability of EU member states to act together and united, especially in front of an emergency. For these reasons, I believe that even though much will depend on the success of the recovery plan, of course, the equation between intergovernmentalism and ineffectiveness needs at this point to be re-examined. In fact, it appears rather simplistic today to claim that the only and single reason for the EU malfunctioning is the departure from an integration by supranationalization. The second novelty brought by the COVID-19 pandemic concerns the fully transnational impact of the virus on all member states in relation with the EU response in terms of politics. Many scholars have already spoke of the variable geometry of the crisis, which means understanding the behavior of member states in the European context, considering the differentiated impacts of a crisis on national level. The response to a crisis entails in the first place a confrontation between national electorates and governments, and secondly, a discussion among the member states. The heads of state and government are thus faced with the question of whether there is a real advantage for their respective domestic preferences to address the issue at the European level, making a possible choice for cooperation. In previous years, in response to continental crisis, there was the tendency toward differentiation, depending both on domestic preferences and on individual political opportunities of the member states. To this point, the question of migration is emblematic, as demonstrated also by the new pact on migration and asylum proposed by the European Commission in September 2020, in which has been much discussed in recent weeks with some possible new initiative at the European level. Many scholars have rightly interpreted the concept of flexible contribution mentioned by the Commission as solidarity à la carte, referring to the EU's inability to give common answers to common problems, as in the case of migration policy. Another good example will be the common foreign and security policy and all the related permanent structural cooperation, of course. Thus, after Lisbon, the variable geometry Europe has remained in place also in the context of crisis management, with countries joining cooperation frameworks on a voluntary basis. As far as the recovery plan is concerned, however, the agreement on the recovery plan went in the opposite direction. As part of the 2021-27 multi-annual financial framework, the Next Generation EU is in the first place a medium plan, and given the nature of the investment, even with potential long-term implications. Moreover, the Next Generation EU is not based on differentiated integration, as all the member states have joined the agreement and will benefit from it. Therefore, the same member states that in recent years have often preferred to respond to crises in a fragmented way have decided this time, on the basis of rational choices, to act together, putting in place a consistent political guidance. The policy outcome was this time far from the lowest common denominator, which in other occasions caused severe criticism to the intergovernmental method. At this point, having established the novelty of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, and coming to the second and final part of my presentation, there are two reasons to argue that the EU recovery instrument put in place by the member states to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic may work as a stabilizer for European integration, bringing potential new balance in EU integration. The first reason concerns the nature of the decision-making processes that led to the agreement on the recovery plan, while the second reasons concern the governance designed to manage these financial instruments, together with its consequences. Of course, much will depend on the concrete impact of the Next Generation EU in the coming years, but the combination of these two elements may constitute two indicators useful to the thesis presented here. The agreement reached at the European Council in July 2020 was first and foremost the culmination of an intergovernmental practice of decision-making in the context of crisis management, which the EU has been practicing for years to reach crucial decisions, often with results far below expectations. According to recent decision-making practices in the context of crisis, the process leading up to an agreement among the member states usually involves three stages. The first step consists in an initial input originating from a political understanding reached by a small group of key member states, France and Germany, in the case of the Next Generation EU. Secondly, this first agreement, often accompanied by a Commission proposal, represents the basis for an intensive bargaining before and during the summits of heads of states and governments, European Council, Euro Summit, and so on. Finally, the Commission transforms the political intent into a package of legislative measures and starts the implementation phase in conjunction with the European Parliament and the Council, when the competencies so required. Furthermore, the Commission is in most cases in charge of monitoring the implementation of the measures under the supervision of the Member States. The recovery instrument designed to relaunch the EU economy after the pandemic followed exactly the decision-making process here mentioned, which, after Lisbon, has often proved to be ineffective and on which there has long been little expectation in terms of policy outcomes. Indeed, there have been many down-year compromises, such as the failure to resolve the migration crisis in Europe, which have cast serious doubts on the consensus-based decision-making method. What remains, this is my argument, what remains for this legitimate skepticism towards the intergovernmental method in the face of the unanimous decision of the EU member states on the Next Generation EU. On the basis of this achievement, EU member states on the recovery plan, it is plausible for me to argue that the Union might have found a new decision-making equilibrium that does not necessarily seize the intergovernmental method as synonym of inefficiency. As it is precisely on this point that I would like to bring my professional experience in a bilateral context of cooperation between member states, Italy and Germany in my case. All too often, the political maturation phase necessary for the Union to act in a more mutually responsible and communitarian way has not been considered enough, especially after the Union expanded its geopolitical and geocultural sphere with the Eastern enlargement. It is in fact hardly ever recognized that the difficulty in the past years to reach consensual compromises could have been caused by a still immature capacity to negotiate at 27. Enlargement has often been read as a purely normative issue without considering the consequences that the profound political and cultural differences could have on the negotiation processes. As a result, the Union is never given the time to grow and become aware of its needs and political system, which by nature is constantly changing geographically and culturally. That is why, from a procedural point of view, the intergovernmental method has often been viewed with suspicion. Yet, many overlook the constructive side of intergovernmentalism, leading to a direct and systematic confrontation between the executive of the EU countries with the aim of reaching inclusive agreement for all parties involved. This process entails a maturation of the political dialogue both on an administrative and political level, the latter paving the way for a discussion either on bilateral basis between member states or within the European Parliament. The result is greater mutual understanding among member states, together with more interaction between the national and the European level of decision making, thus increasing the capacity to reach agreements within the framework of the European institution. In this way, the EU experiences a constant intensification of democratic practice among European countries, both through formal and informal channels, which is the primary condition for the pursuit of political common goals. Turning to the, I will draw some conclusion on the basis of this renewed political maturity. I'm talking about the context of policy coordination among the member states. European integration could find a new balance in the coming years, with the EU able to act in a more far-sighted and united way than before. This would also have to move away from a dichotomous view of the EU, seeing the member states as always entrenched behind the exclusive national interest, while the supranational institution as the sole champions of the common good. Overall, if there is anything that the COVID-19 pandemic has taught the European societies, it is that there are interests in the Union that are truly accepted and shared by all member states, and represent the fundamental starting point for taking steps forward for European integration. There is in fact no coexistence within the EU between a meta supranational state and the old nation states. The Union is and it always remains the political and democratic expression of its constantly changing member states and their citizens, whose institutions are shaped by their preferences. The member states search for consensus, even in today's enlarged and complex union, and even with great difficulties and misunderstandings, is, in my view, the best indication of the vibrancy of the European integration process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matteo, very much for your very interesting contribution that draws a different light on the issue of intergovernmentalism, and for which we thank you very much. And now I move on to our fourth panelist, Mr. Richard Corbett. Richard is widely known to many of us, not only as a former member of the European Parliament, but also as Anthony said before, as the author of the book on European Parliament, which is very clear and also very exhaustive. And I would like to say also a point of reference for many of us in EPRS. Richard is now a member of the Common Secretariat of the Conference to the Future of Europe. And if I may say that, Richard, your role in the Common Secretariat seems to be a bit in continuation for the role that you had in the past as Parliament's co-rapporteur for the Convention and the Constitutional Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty. So Richard will offer us a glimpse into the future of the EU, with particular attention to the Conference on the Future of Europe that has just started now in May and held its first plenary session on the 19th of June. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Richard.
Remind me, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And your reference to my book on the Parliament reminds me that it's also a great cure for insomnia. I will mention indeed the Conference on the Future of Europe, but given what has been said so far, I'd like to place it in the context of some of the things that have been said, which have been very interesting, I think, from all the panelists. And I would come back to the concept of system change in the European Union. I would argue that it is a constant. The EU has always been evolving and changing, but it's done it in incremental steps and in slow motion. You've never had a sudden root and branch reform. You've had a succession of treaties from the Single Acts, Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon, and so on. In between treaties, the institutions or the member states have sometimes taken the treaties and stretched them like a piece of elastic to go a little bit further than perhaps a minimalist interpretation would have implied. I mean, just take one example. When the treaty gave the Parliament the right to vote on the Commission before it takes office, the Commission as a whole, it said, right, before we take a vote, we will conduct parliamentary hearings with each commissioner. Wasn't in the treaty. It was disliked by the other institutions, and the Parliament said, we're not going to take our vote until every commissioner has appeared before the relevant parliamentary committee for a 3-hour grilling. And in the end, the other institutions, the Commission in particular, had to accept that. It's now part of the acquis. Nobody thinks it's extraordinary, but it was, in its time, a good example of stretching the elastic, in this case on the institutional front. So what drives these institutional changes? I think there are two drivers. One is events, crises very often, that have to be settled, that have forced changes. And the other are processes that are put in motion, which in the end get the gears moving and eventually leads to some sort of change. An example of the former, of events, I mean, there's plenty of examples through history. You could say the fall of the Berlin Wall was one of the things that led to a strengthening of the common foreign and security policy. Or more recently, the Eurozone crisis led to the Treaty on Stability and Coordination, the so-called Fiscal Compact. Or now the coronavirus crisis led to the creation of the economic consequences, led to the creation of the NGEU. So crises, events lead to changes, but also processes. Let's not forget the the Lisbon Treaty, of course, famously was preceded by a process of setting up a convention involving national parliaments, the governments, the European Parliament, that came up with proposals. It set in a great machinery. In the end, that builds up political momentum. Something had to come out of it. You could say the same going back further in history. The Spinelli draft treaty, initiated by the Parliament, the parliamentary assizes with the national parliaments held in Rome before the Maastricht Treaty, the reflection group ahead of the Amsterdam Treaty. Once you start a process of talking things through, thinking of coming up with proposals, maybe all those proposals won't get through. In fact, they never have all got through, but they've always led to some changes in the system. And of course, when you combine the two, crises and processes, then there's extra momentum. Not a guarantee, but extra momentum for incremental change. Now we have this Conference on the Future of Europe as a process. A new one, not been tried before. It's not really a conference, it's a process of consulting citizens across the whole of Europe to an extent that has never been tried before, encouraging debates across Europe, events, discussions, debates in large or small groups or even individual citizens. They can put their recommendations up on this digital platform. Never been tried before, a platform, a multilingual platform on that scale. Already 20,000 contributions nearly are already up there. There will be far more. You distill some ideas from that. That goes to citizens' panels, never been tried before at European level, randomly selected by an opinion polling company in the usual way to take balances of socioeconomic groups to make sure it's representative of age, geography, gender, and so on. What will come out of that? Will it work? We don't know. But all this will feed ideas, proposals into the conference plenary, where citizens and their representatives of the panels, NGOs and so on, will sit together with elected representatives from national parliaments, European Parliament, national governments, regions, to try and build a consensus of proposals to take the EU forward. This may not work, but it may well. It will be one of those processes that builds up some political momentum, which will then be taken forward. Now, I think that citizens are likely to, in the first place, come up with policy priorities. What do we want to do at European level? What perhaps we don't want to do together at European level? But I think it's quite likely they will say we should do more at European level on climate change, on fighting pandemics, on standing together in the world, on foreign policy, on ensuring that our single market is fair, socially just, and is green. We will see. We don't know what they will come up with. But I should imagine it would be policy focused. But then you immediately are confronted with the question, does the EU have the capacity to deliver? That will vary subject by subject. If you're saying the EU should do more on fighting cross-border health problems like pandemics, there, perhaps without needing to change the treaty, it's a question of strengthening the executive capacity of the EU, the Commission and the Medicines Agency and so on, to give them the stronger powers to deploy resources, sign contracts, distribute equipment, ventilators, PPE, vaccines. If you're talking about social justice, helping balance in the single market, perhaps helping less prosperous regions and member states, then you're talking about the budgetary capacity of the EU, among other things. If you're talking about its ability to act in the world on foreign policy, when at the moment even a declaration condemning Belarus can be subject to a veto of one minister around the table, then you're talking about the decision-taking system of the EU and in the Council where you need unanimity. Indeed, if you look at most of the things where the EU is seen to fail by the public, it's those things that need unanimity, where you see deadlock, division, months of negotiations, sometimes failure. That's where the EU is most often perceived to fail. So you quickly come on to the question of unanimity. So you move from policy areas to the EU system, the functioning of the EU. And if you're increasing its capacity to take decisions, you've also got to look at its democratic accountability and how transparent and democratic it is. So that's how I see this process coming through the convention, the conference on the future of Europe, mixed in with the different crises. But then what happens next will be the big question, if there are ideas on the table. And then you come in a little bit to what has been touched on, the role of the European Council, because, of course, any of those proposals that need unanimity in the Council, need member state agreement, like treaty change, but not only treaty change, it's likely to end up at European Council meetings. Now, much has been said about the European Council overstepping its role and putting its finger into every pie. That, yes and no. In day-to-day processes, yes, it does get involved to a degree in day-to-day processes of the European Union. But remember, it only adopts conclusions. They actually have to be followed up by the proper European community processes. But I digress. Here we're talking about the European Council's role when it comes to system change. And it's almost unavoidable in the current state of the treaties, because to change fundamental things, including the treaties themselves, you need unanimity of member states and national ratification, as has been said. Until that changes one day, you cannot avoid key things like this going to a European Council meeting. And whether we like it or not. And then you come to the question, can the European Council find agreement on steps that will take us forward? And the question then is, what do you do about states that are reticent or indeed opposed to changes that would take the European Union forward or strengthen its capacity in different areas or improve its functioning in different areas? And there's two ways really of dealing with reticent member states. One is to make deals. I mean, give them something they want and link it to something they're more reticent about. Historically, remember the Single European Act. Margaret Thatcher was against strengthening the capacity of the Union, didn't want qualified majority voting, but wanted a single market. The deal was, if you want a single market, you've got to have qualified majority voting in those fields where we need to legislate to achieve a single market. That was the deal. More recently, you could say next generation EU, the deal with those countries that were a bit more reticent about it. The frugal four was to give them bits of rebate on their ordinary budget, but with Hungary and Poland, where it was linked to the possibility of withdrawing financial assistance if they break the rule of law, etc., there was a carrot and stick there. We want that capacity, you want the money. So you can make perhaps deals like that. There have also been deals with opt-outs, of course, famously. Denmark, Ireland, and when it was a member state, the UK, in successive IGCs have been allowed to opt out of certain things, but allow the rest to continue to deepen cooperation in different fields. The other way is in the threat, implicit or explicit, to go ahead with creating something new without the states in question. This goes right back to the origin of the European Union. When the coal and steel community was set up, remember, that was 6 states breaking away or creating a separate framework from the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe in those days was the big new thing. It was the first thing just set up after the war. It was full of hopes for it. It had about 14 member states at the time. But the Scandinavian countries and Britain didn't want it to deepen any further, not give it any supranational powers. So 6 countries said, right, we're setting up something different by ourselves, the Schuman Declaration, the coal and steel community, and so on. Or more recently, 10 years ago, the when Cameron tried to block treaty changes on what became the fiscal compact, the others said, we will set up an intergovernmental treaty by ourselves, leave you out of it. An intergovernmental treaty which, by the way, although it was intergovernmental, conferred powers on the EU institutions, on the Commission, on the central bank, which they didn't have before. So be wary of this division, supranational versus intergovernmental. Sometimes intergovernmental methods can lead to a strengthening of the supranational side of things. But the threats to do things without you has been there implicitly, at least, and explicitly on occasion. If it really came to the crunch in a year or two's time, if you really had, for instance, and I'm talking imaginatively here off the top of my head and on my own behalf, not of anybody else, but let us imagine that, say, 2 states, can't think who, but say 2 states don't want any treaty revision, don't want to deepen the EU at all in any respect, don't want to move to qualified majority voting on foreign policy or on the rule of law, don't want to do anything. And the others think it's necessary for the EU to be credible, to act, to deal with the challenges it's facing on foreign policy and whatever. We've got to do this. What could you do? Theoretically, at least, you could sign a new treaty among the 24, 25, identical to the current treaties except on those points, among yourselves, then all invoke Article 50 and leave the current European Union and join that new one, leaving those 2 states by themselves, or 3 states, or whatever they are. Is that an incredible hypothesis? I throw it out there. I think it's à la limite. It would only be in an exceptional situation. I think compromise and muddling through is much more likely scenario. But faced with an extreme situation, then an extreme measure like that might be put on the table. And just putting it on the table might itself put enough pressure on for a compromise to be found. Now that's off the top of my head. Don't quote it as being anybody's point of view other than just a funny idea I've come up with. It doesn't represent anybody's view at all. But these are the sort of questions which, looking at the history of how the EU has developed incrementally, these are the sort of things that I think will, in the end game of this current process, have to be looked at. Thank you.
I don't know if Sylvia has connection problem.
Yeah, I think she has a technical.
I think she has. Okay, look, until Sylvia comes back, let me just invite the 60 or so people who are still online. I think we peaked at about 80 to come in with any reflections, any questions. We've got a bit of time, not a huge amount. We've got quite a long question here from Maria Diaz to all panelists. Thank you very much to all speakers for their insights and for their very rich and clear presentations. If I may, I would like to raise 2 questions, probably for Mr. Corbett and Messrs. Corbett and Fabbrini. One, if you had to choose just one institutional change that would be adopted in the Conference on the Future of Europe, which one would you choose? And 2, in which way can representative democracy, parliamentary democracy, coexist with deliberative democracy, citizens' panel, in the Conference on the Future of Europe? Very interesting questions. I think Sylvia's back. I think you probably had a connection difficulty. Just throwing that question out to any of the colleagues around the table who'd like to come in and offer thoughts on that. And we won't just limit it to Corbett and Fabbrini. In fact, maybe we ask somebody else in the first instance, whether Helle, for example, whether you've got any perspective on that tension, if you like, and or one institutional change that we'd like to see. And as we're running fairly short of time, keep it tight. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the questions to Maria Diaz. Of course, very difficult questions, and I'm delighted, of course, to be the first person to have a go with them. Let me just see. So, so one institutional change. That's a very, very good question. I think actually, and maybe that's not something we have discussed so much today, but I think that one of the great challenges for the EU is actually, and I don't think we can ignore it, to be honest. This is not just about Poland and Hungary, for instance. I'm going to put a name on these countries. It's not just about that and rule of law crisis. This is also, we also have some tendencies, to be honest, going on in all member states, or many member states, in all parts of the EU. And I think what the EU is facing, we are facing some also greater challenges, which are actually also about this thing about the metropolitan cities, the big capitals, and the rural areas, the faraway little towns. And I think this is a common problem to all the EU member states to some level. We also see it in my country. And I think this is something we really have to try to sort of solve in a way. We have, maybe if the EU could sort of assist in seeing this as a common challenge, something that we all have to face and do something about, and it's a democratic problem. We have to face that too. And I think there actually both the European Parliament plays a role, because you're the only representative institution you represent. I mean, who the voters want to be there. It's very pluralistic in a way, but I'm also wondering whether it might be an interesting idea to involve the national parliaments actually a bit more. And I know this might not help many of the problems that we are discussing today and how we can be more efficient and all this, but I'm still going to be a bit trying to put that on the table, whether strengthen the democracy, whether sort of providing people with a feeling, also in the small towns far out, where they don't see the advantages of Europeanization, of globalization, with a chance to appreciate it more. And there could be many ways of doing this, but you ask about institutions. So I say, okay, let's see, could we somehow take the parliaments, the national parliaments, for instance, a little more into play, but it could also be the citizens, Maria Diaz, as you proposed yourself, platforms, anything. I've already spoken too much, so I'll just pass on the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the moderation, as it were, to Sylvia, so she can pick up and take this forward.
Thank you, Anthony. I think one of the worst nightmares for a moderator to be kicked out has been materialized during this session. But I heard that some questions were already made, and they have been answered. Actually, there was a further question from Michaela Del Monte on the possibility to use more intensively enhanced cooperation. But I think this is a question, or better an answer, that is a bit somehow linked to the intervention of Richard before, in the sense that probably the conference will also deal with the quantum leap of how we will proceed with integration of the European Union in the future. So I think if I don't know if we have the time for a further question, but it will be quite, I would ask really very short, I would say telegraphic, but almost telegraphic answer from the speakers. I would like to ask a question to Helle, who just spoke now, but his presentation was extremely interesting for me. And I would like to ask her if, but of course, any other panelist is more than welcome to answer this. The issue of the cleavage between EU and anti-EU has been one of the, I would say, prominent issues in the last elections. With the COVID and with the crisis that we have been passing through, what do you think, if this is a matter of populism being put aside, or is it something that will come up will continue and will come up also in the future? Thank you.
So I'll try to be very brief. So Sylvia, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking whether, because you're asking whether COVID-19 has stimulated more populism and whether that's a future challenge in general that could proceed.
Where it has mitigated the effect of populism.
Oh, okay, I see it, yes. Okay, that's a very interesting question, Sylvia, and I'm actually going to quote, because I've heard another person reply to such a question. I think I'll actually take his reply, sorry. And what he said was, which was very interesting, that it has in many countries really depended very much on how the political leaders have handled, like you say, the COVID-19. And it doesn't necessarily have to do whether it's a populist leader or a not populist leader. Some have just been more successful than others. For instance, in the UK, it turned out in a very good way. But in Brazil, for instance, sorry for moving outside the EU, we see, you know, that people are really reacting in a way, in a negative way, towards how that has been handled. So I'm not really quite sure. I mean, I think it differs a bit actually from member state to member state at the local level, how people see this also in relation both to their own leaders and relation to EU. I think it might be actually a bit more complicated, but I think I've spoken far too much, so I'm just going to pass on the floor to some other speakers.
Yes, thank you, Helle. I agree. It's something that is not easy to detect, in fact. Of course, I invite any of the other panelists to reply or to react on one of the previous questions. Federico, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. If I may, I think it was very interesting, the presentation of my colleagues and the questions that were raised. So if I can take just a minute very, very quickly to answer to some of the ideas that were raised and answer some of the questions as well. First point on Matteo's presentation on intergovernmentalism, I think it was refreshing to see a defense of intergovernmentalism. Most of us today were critical, so it was good for the debate to have a different perspective. And to be fair, I mean, of course, NGEU was approved through intergovernmental decision-making processes, and yet I think it is important to see the limits of that mechanism of decision-making. It does work on occasion, but very often it leads to gridlock. If there's not a convergence of interest between member states, that can paralyze the European Union, and we've seen it in multiple areas, from migration to the rule of law and so on. That takes me actually to Maria Diaz's question, because I think precisely in light of the weaknesses of intergovernmentalism, one big reforms that, if I had a magic wand, I would be seeking for the EU, and this is something I wrote about already years ago. I think what Europe is missing is a presidency, in the same way how the American presidency works. That is an executive institution that can act as an integrative force for the EU. Ironically, I think having a unitary presidency for Europe would be good for the European Parliament. We know it, Richard knows it better than anyone else, that actually the Parliament is stronger in congressional systems of government, where there is a clear separation between executives and the legislature, like in the United States and like in the EU today, rather than in parliamentary systems of government, as in the UK, where the Parliament is just rubber stamping what the government wants. So, in fact, pushing Europe towards a more clear-cut separation of power system with a presidency and a legislature centered around the Parliament with clear separation would probably be the reform I would be seeking. Now, how to get there, and that's my third and last point. And I was pleased to hear that Richard is thinking about sort of the option of moving forward without the reluctant member states. As Richard knows, Sylvia mentioned it before, I have made a proposal, I put forward a proposal for the AFCO Committee of the European Parliament to think about a political compact as a possible outcome of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And the idea there is to use the precedent of the fiscal compact to draft a new treaty with new entry into force rules, which would allow us to sort of bypass the unanimity hurdles of Article 48 TEU. So perhaps, since you are, Richard, in the Secretariat of the conference, that's something worth for your organization to consider moving forward. Because indeed, as you said, I do suspect we will face idiosyncratic opposition to whatever proposal comes out of this process. So I think it's important to be ready to think of alternatives.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you very much. Richard, do you want to?
Yeah, just very, very quickly to say that in response to what Federico said about the presidency, you would not need to change the treaty to join together the posts of President of the Commission and President of the European Council. You simply have to appoint the same person to both. The treaty left that option open. That's a question of political will to do so. And on the question of what single change you would want, if you only had one change to the system that you could do, I would say extending the field of qualified majority voting rather than unanimity. That's the single most important thing.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much. Words full of gravitas, your ones, and we thank you for your message. I just wanted to ask if there is any final statement that the speakers want to do. Just really 2 words to conclude this interesting session. Helle, Matteo. So then I am afraid that we have come to the end of our roundtable. Let me just conclude with a few words, just to say that the discussion has been very interesting and has multifaceted a look into our last political developments in the EU has been. So we have seen how the European Union would be in deep need of change to better function. We have seen how the rule of law, or better, the crisis of the rule of law, can be perhaps even a catalyst for building up a constitutional identity. And we have seen a different, I would say, inter-institutional relations and intergovernmentalism under a different light. So all this, and perhaps even more, will be tackled with the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is a unique event on its own in the history of the European Union. And I would say that we as EPRS, we will follow it with our events and with our publications very closely. So my last words are to thank our keynote speaker, who is not here with us anymore, but thank her very much. I thank our panelists, Federico, Richard, Helle, and Matteo, and I pass on the word to Anthony to conclude. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sylvia, for so effectively moderating the conversation. And as you say, it's been extremely thought-provoking and covered a huge amount of territory. And it's one of a series of institutional discussions which EPRS is trying to put on and offer a platform for in this way. And in fact, our next EPRS event, so I suspect it'll be of some interest to many of the people who've been tuned into this one, is a book talk about a recent book published in Italy, the English title of which is The Rediscovery of the European Parliament by Giacomo Federico. And we're going to get another panel together on Tuesday, the 13th of July at lunchtime to discuss the European Parliament as a political institution, its past, its present, and its future. So look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at that discussion. And thank you to everybody who has participated and stayed the course of this discussion. And thank you, of course, especially to all of those who have spoken. So it's been a great conversation. It's a very interesting and important subject, and it's one I hope that's put everybody in a very good mood for the work that they're going to be doing during the rest of the afternoon. So, a bientôt and see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.